So you started New Energy Finance in 2004, when clean energy was really a baby in a lot of respects. I imagine what you did back then, and of course your role has changed. You sold it to Bloomberg. You've stepped down recently from CEO to chair, right? I imagine what you did back then and what you do now has changed a lot. Can you just give us a little bit of the story of New Energy Finance, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and your role?
So you're right. I founded it in 2004. Sold it 5 years later, 2009, to Bloomberg, and extraordinary. It's now 5 years later, and at the beginning of 2014, I stepped down and became the chairman of the advisory board. And it's kind of a half-time role because I do these other things, mainly revolving around London, but I'm still deeply, deeply involved. To your question about how things change, well, when I set the thing up, I did kind of everything. So I worked with the programmers on the first database that sat behind the website.
Polish programmers, right?
That's right. Our first programmer was a man I met on the internet in a chat room. Well, there was a website called Rent-A-Coder, which is now called Freelancer.com, and I actually I went through a very rigorous process of selecting the programmer, as you would do, as you have to. But I did actually do it via this website, and ended up with a programmer I'd never met who was working in Poland. During the day, he was working for a big consumer goods company, and during the night and on the weekends, he and I were working together, structuring the databases. And then I had a co-founder, and he and I then had a bunch of interns that started entering data, and that's how it started. And I did everything. I entered data, I structured the database, I entered data, I wrote news stories, and then I made sales calls. So I used to call it playing ping pong against yourself, because you had to create the content and then run around the table and try and sell it, and then create some more content and run around the table and sell it. It was unbelievably intense.
That's fascinating. I thought you originally had some big investors, actually.
No,
because you have strong connections.
I didn't take any money into the business until 2006. January the 26th or January the 22nd. No, it was January the 17th, and I remember because payroll was January the 26th, and I had credit card debts, and I don't know what would have happened. It could have got ugly, but that's when I brought in my investors. So I started in 2004, and by the way, the last payroll I got, which was with Group Arnaud, was in 2001. I took no salary. My entire earnings between 2001 and January 2006, when we finally got onto some very modest salary, my entire earnings had been a few tens of thousands of pounds. I'd really had a very, very tough time before founding it. I didn't go, in retrospect, maybe I should have brought investors in much earlier, and then I could have hired an editor, and I could have done things in a much more sort of grandiose way. But this was entrepreneurship. I mean, we were bringing in interns to do data entry and paying them £10 a day. I shouldn't probably admit that, because I don't. But actually, it was all cleared later. We actually got visited to see whether whether our internship program was real, and of course it was. But that was the sort of stuff we were doing at the beginning, and it wasn't until 2006, when we knew the business model and we already had our first clients, that I felt comfortable going to external investors and bringing them in, and actually a lot of my friends and then when we did bring in money, we did it through a fairly large number of angels. I didn't go for venture money because, frankly, I didn't want a venture capitalist running my business. Yeah. At that point, I knew what I wanted to do, and I wanted to have the license to do it.
And can you speak about what inspired you to start that?
Well, let me just complete it, because how does that change now? Well, obviously now, 10 years later, this thing professionalized enormously and very, very quickly, because very quickly we started to build what I would call the company we wanted to be. And in the information business, we're not in the information, we're in the branded information business. What I wanted to make sure was that if anybody ever saw whether it was a news story or a subset of our data, or an analysis, or if it was one of our events or a piece of consulting, I wanted them to feel very comfortable that they were working with the premier outfit. Now, when you're an entrepreneur, what do? You're not the premier outfit. You're nobody. You're a little scrappy entrepreneur with a bunch of interns running around. Well, what you do is you make sure that you always dress right, talk right, you act like you're still at McKinsey. Not, you kind of still at McKinsey, or you realize that if you're going to sell a piece of information, you can never say this is the second best report on the cost of solar, but it's really cheap. That will never sell anything. You've got to go in at a premium point, and you've got to act like that. It's got to be internally consistent. The people you hire have to understand that. You can't have a wonderful piece of analysis and a spelling mistake. Immediately people think, well, if you've got the spelling wrong, what else is wrong? So we pushed really, really hard. And then the other thing was I hung out with and tried to get as involved as I could with people like the UN, the Sustainable Energy Finance Initiative of UNEP, or the UNEP, yes, UNEP CEFI. We were chosen to write a report for them in 2007, and we pulled the stops out, and we tried to do that as well as we knew how, because that's the UN working with us. And I worked with the World Economic Forum. We wrote a green investing report for the World Economic Forum. And so then when people...
Did you have any special connections back then?
No, I had no connections because they all got wiped out in I was working in technology during the dot-com, the tech boom bust. And so what happened was my connections that I had, my professional Rolodex, essentially it was like a neutron bomb that hit it. They got wiped out. And although I had these networks, I'm very bad at asking for help. It's just not something I'm good at. So to go to somebody that I knew from McKinsey and say, I am really in trouble. I have no job. I have no prospect of a job. I'm essentially unemployable now because I've been too involved in the dot-com and the tech boom bust and blah, 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 and I've got no contacts. They all lost their jobs. Please help me. I'm not very good at that. So I actually did very little networking. Maybe it was a mistake, but on the other hand, I had a lot of time to think. I was traveling, and what I could see was that the energy sector was going to go through a very substantial transformation. We could call it was approaching a kind of a Kodak moment without knowing it, because they were so busy building pipelines and doing the standard things with coal and oil and gas, and everything was all very jolly, and there were things that they were not putting together, like discussions of depletion, like the fact that there was the second Gulf War, like climate change. I think it was the third IPCC report, 2003. The fact that there was a big blackout in the US because of aging infrastructure, a blackout in Europe because of aging infrastructure, brownouts in Brazil where I happened to be visiting. I was coming back from Bolivia where I was climbing. In Bolivia, there was they were actually out on the streets protesting against selling the gas to North America. So there was all this stuff, and then because of my background and some of the networks that I had retained, I could also see technological solutions. I believe almost religiously in the experience curve. So I could see solar was going to keep coming down. I could see wind was going to keep coming down the cost curve. And also, I could see some of the reasons you don't do distributed solutions are costs of control. And if you go back, let's say to 1995, if you had a solar rooftop, the only way you could control it was by writing customized software and buying telecom time. Now it costs nothing. You do that through the internet. It's the Internet of Things. And I could see, because I'd worked in that space, that the cost of controlling distributed assets was just going to become, was essentially going to shrink to zero. So the reason not to generate electricity in your home, they were just going away. So I could see a bunch of problems, I could see a bunch of solutions, and then I had to figure out where to get involved. And my skills are in talking. They're also in analysis. They're also in managing international teams, international sales teams, analysts, journalists. So I put it all together and created New Energy Finance.
Well, that was actually one of the things I was going to ask about a bit, were your transitioning skills, because your bachelor's degree is in thermodynamics.
Correct. Yeah.
and engineering, right? And then you transitioned. You went to Harvard for business.
Yeah.
What drove you back then to go from thermodynamics to business?
Money. Well, it wasn't money. It was also location and lifestyle, because so my father was a mechanic, and I obviously, was pushed by my parents with education and so on. But I didn't know that I probably ought to have become a lawyer. So a mechanic with a degree is an engineer, so I became an engineer. And I never thought that actually there are no engineering jobs in London. Of course now there are, but back then there weren't. So when I graduated, and of course I wouldn't live anywhere else, so I sort of had this kind of soul-searching moment where I thought, what have I done? I've gone and studied this stuff, which is intellectually fantastically interesting, but I don't want to go to Barrow and Furness or wherever the engineering jobs are. And also, consulting paid a lot more, and the lifestyle, I'm sure it's sort of somewhere in your notes. I also was on the national ski team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the lifestyle of being a consultant, going to business and doing consultancy then fitted, because I could disappear for 3-4 months a year, do my ski competitions, and then come back and pick up where I left off. So I sort of did that for a few years, and then really didn't come back to energy until after everything else I did kind of blew up in 2001. And maybe I should have gone off and founded Facebook or something, who knows. My luck, I would have founded MySpace or so. Well, so I lost confidence in that kind of Web 2.0, and
it sounds like you had interest in these issues of...
Exactly. The thing about energy is it just joins the dots. Steve Jobs said that when you go through your career, you can't join the dots going forwards. You can only join the dots looking backwards. I had worked in the cheese industry as a consultant. Well, guess what? Bioprocessing. Talk to me about biofuels, bioplastics. I kind of know how that space works, because it's not that different from an industry where they use fungi and enzymes and it's all about lipids and separation and so on. So everything I've done kind of came rushing together in a rather spooky way, which I now understand was obviously my destiny, which I don't really believe in, but it clearly was.